During the last part of our imprisonment, the daily ration consisted of very watery soup given out once daily, and the usual small bread ration. In addition to that, there was the so-called extra allowance, consisting of 3/4 of an ounce of margarine, or of a slice of poor quality sausage, or of a little piece of cheese, or a bit of synthetic honey, or a spoonful of watery jam, varying daily. In calories, this diet was absolutely inadequate, especially taking into consideration our heavy manual work and our constant exposure to the cold, inadequate clothing. The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts instead of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off. When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. One after another, the members of the little community in our hut died. Each of us could calculate with fair accuracy whose turn would be the next and when his own would come. After many observations, we knew the symptoms well, which made the correctness of our prognosis quite certain. He won't last long, or this is the next one, we whispered to each other, and when during our daily search for lice, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought like, this here, my body is really a corpse already. I mentioned above how unavoidable were the thoughts about foods and favorite dishes which forced themselves into the consciousness of the prisoner whenever he had a moment to spare. Perhaps it can be understood then that even the strongest of us was longing for the time when he could have fairly good food again, not for the sake of good food itself, but for the sake of knowing that a subhuman existence which had made us unable to think of anything other than food would at least cease. Those who had not gone through a similar experience can hardly conceive of the soul-destroying mental conflict and clashes of willpower which a famished man experiences. They can hardly grasp what it means to stand digging in a trench, listening only for the rising siren to announce 9:30 or 10 a.m., the half-hour lunch interval when bread would be rationed out as long as it was still available. Repeatedly asking the foreman if he wasn't a disagreeable fellow what the time was, and tenderly touching a piece of bread in one's coat pocket, first stroking it with frozen gloveless fingers, then breaking off a crumb and putting it in one's mouth, and finally, with the last bit of willpower, pocketing it again, having promised oneself the morning to hold out till afternoon. We could hold endless debates on the sense or nonsense of certain methods of dealing with the small bed ration, which was given out only once daily during the latter part of our confinement. There were two schools of thoughts. One was in favor of eating up the ration immediately. This had the twofold advantage of satisfying the worst hunger pangs for a very short time, at least once a day, and of safeguarding against possible theft or loss of the ration. And the second group, which held with dividing the ration up, used different arguments. I finally joined their ranks. The most ghastly moment of 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when at a still nocturnal hour, these three shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began to tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema. Undernourishment, besides being the cause of the general preoccupation with food, probably also explains the fact that the sexual urge was generally absent. Apart from the initial effects of shock, this appears to be the only explanation of a phenomenon which a psychologist was bound to observe in those all-male camps. That as opposed to all other strictly male establishments, such as army barracks, there was a little sexual perversion. Even in his dreams, the prisoner did not seem to concern himself with sex, although his frustrated emotions and his finer, higher feelings did not define expression in them. With the majority of the prisoners, the primitive life and the efforts of having to concentrate on just having one's skin led to a total disregard of anything not serving that purpose, and explained the prisoner's complete lack of sentiment. This was brought home to me on my transfer from Auschwitz to a camp affiliated with Dachau. The train which carried us about 2,000 prisoners passed through Vienna. At about midnight, we passed one of the Viennese rail stations. The track was going to lead us past the street where I was born, past the house where I had lived many years of my life, in fact, until I was taken as a prisoner. There were 50 of us in the prison car, which had two small barred peepholes. There was only enough room for one group to squat on the floor, while the others who had to stand up for hours crowded around the peepholes. Standing on the tiptoe and looking past the others, heads throwing on the bars of the window, I caught an eerie glimpse of my native in the town. We all felt more dead than alive, since we thought that our transport was heading for the camp at Mauthausen and that we had only 1 or 2 weeks to live. I had the distinct feeling that I saw the streets, the squares and the houses of my childhood with the eyes of a dead man who had come back from another world and was looking down on a ghostly city. After hours of delay, the train left the station. There was a street, my street, the young lads who I had a number of years of camp life behind them and for whom such a journey was a great event, stared attentively through the people. I began to beg them, to entreat them, to let me stand in front for one moment only. I tried to explain how much a look through that window meant to me. Just then my request was refused with rudeness and cynicism. You lived here all those years? Well, then you have seen quite enough already. In general, there was also a cultural hibernation. In the camp, there were 2 exceptions to this, politics and religion. Politics were talked about everywhere in camp almost continuously. The discussions were based chiefly on rumors which were snapped up and passed around avidly. The rumors about the military situation were usually contradictory. They followed one another rapidly and succeeded only in making a contribution to the war of nerves that was waged in the minds of all the prisoners. Many times, hopes for a speedy end to the war, which had been fanned by optimistic rumors, were disappointed. Some men lost all hope, but it was the incongruable optimists who were the most irritating companions. The religious interest of the prisoners, as soon as I developed it, was the most sincere imaginable. The depth and vigor of religious belief often surprised and moved the new arrival. Most impressive in this connection were improvised prayers or services in the corner of a hut. In the winter and spring of 1945, there was an outbreak of typhus which infected nearly all the prisoners. The mortality was great among the weak, who had to keep on with their hard work as long as they possibly could. The quarters for the sick were most inadequate. There were practically no medicines or attendants. Some of the symptoms of the disease were extremely disagreeable, an irrepressible aversion to even a scrap of food, which was an additional danger to life, and terrible attacks of delirium. The worst case of delirium was suffered by a friend of mine who thought that he was dying and wanted to pray. In his delirium, he could not find the words to do so. To avoid these attacks of delirium, I tried, as did many of the others, to keep awake for most amount of the night. For hours I composed speeches in my mind. Eventually I began to reconstruct the manuscript which I had lost in the disinfection chamber of Auschwitz and scribbled the keywords in shorthand on tiny scraps of paper. Occasionally, a scientific debate developed in the camp. Once I witnessed something I had never seen, even in my normal life, although it lay somewhat near my own professional interests. A spiritualistic seance I had been invited to attended by the camp's chief doctor, who knew that I was a specialist in psychiatry. The meeting took place in his small private room in the sick quarters. A small circle had gathered, among them quite illegally the warrant officer from the sanitation squad. One man began to invoke the spirits with a kind of prayer. The camp's clerk sat in front of a blank sheet of paper without any conscious intention of writing. During the next 10 minutes, his pencil slowly drew lines across the paper, forming quite legibly Vae Vi. It was asserted that the cleric had never learned the Latin, that he had never before heard the words Vae Victis, woe to the vanquished. In my opinion, he must have heard them once in his life without recollecting them, and they must have been available to the spirit of his subconscious mind at that time. A few months before our liberation and the end of war, in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the life in concentrated camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain, but the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp life better than did those of robust nature. In order to make myself clear, I'm forced to fall back on personal experience. Let me tell you what happened on those early mornings when we had to march to our work site. There were shouted commands: detachment, forward, march, left 2, 3, 4, left 2, 3, 4, left 2, 3, 4. First man about, left and left and left and left. Caps off, these words passed sound in my ears even now. At the order, caps off, we passed the gate of the camp, and searchlights were trained upon us. Whoever did not march smallly got a kick. And worse off was the man who, because of the cold, had pulled his cap back over his ears before permission was given. We stumbled on in the darkness, over big stones and through large puddles. Along the one road leading from the camp, the accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, the man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now, I do hope they are better off in their camps and do not know what is happening to us." That brought thoughts of my own wife to my mind. And as we stumbled on for miles, sleeping on icy spots, supporting each other time and again, dragging one another up and onward, nothing was said. But we both know each of us was thinking of his wife. Occasionally, I looked at the sky where the stars were fading and pink light of the morning was beginning to spread behind a dark band of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, saw her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was then more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment in the contemplation of his beloved. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievements may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, an honorable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the words. The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory. In front of me, a man stumbled, and those following him fell on top of him. The guard rushed over and used his whip on them all. Thus my thoughts were interrupted for a few minutes, but soon my soul found its way back from the prisoner's existence to another world, and I resumed talk with my loved one. I asked her questions, and she answered me. She questioned me in return, and I answered. "Stop!" We had arrived at our work site. Everybody rushed into the dark hut in the hope of getting a fairly decent tool. Each prisoner got a spade or pickaxe. "Can't you hurry up, you pigs?" Soon we had resumed the previous day's positions in the ditch. The frozen ground cracked under the points of the pickaxes and sparks flew. The men were silent, their brains numb. My mind still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she were still alive. I knew only one thing, which I've learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in his spiritual being. His inner self, and whether or not he's actually present, whether or not he's still alive at all, ceases somehow to be of importance. I did not know whether my wife was still alive, and I had no means of finding out. But at that moment, it ceased to matter. There was no need for me to know. Nothing could touch the strength of my wife, my thought, and the image of my beloved. Had I known then that my wife was dead, I think that I would still have given myself, undisturbed by that knowledge, to the contemplation of her image. This intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence, by letting him escape into the past. When given free rein, his imagination played with past events, often not important ones but minor happenings and trifling things. His nostalgic memory glorified them, and they assumed a strange character. Their world and their existence seemed very distant, and the spirit reached out for them longingly. In my mind, I took bus rides, unlocked the front door of my apartment, answered my telephone, switched on the electric lights. Our thoughts often centered on such details, and these memories could move on to tears. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. If someone had seen our faces on the journey from Auschwitz to Bavarian camp, as we beheld the mountains of Salzburg with their summits glowing in sunset, through the little barred windows of the prisoner carriage, he would never have believed that those were the faces of men who had given up all hopes of life and liberty. Despite that factor, or maybe because of it, we were carried away by nature's beauty, which we had missed for so long. In camp too, a man might draw the attention of a comrade working next to him to a nice view of the setting sun shining through the tall trees of the Bavarian woods, as in the famous watercolor by Dürer, the same woods in which we had built an enormous hidden munitions plant. One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of our hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly grounds and see the wonderful sunset. Standing outside, we saw sinister clouds glowing in the west and the whole sky alive with clouds of ever-changing shapes and colors, from steel blue to blood red. The desolate grey mud huts provided a sharp contrast, while the puddles on the muddy ground reflected the glowing sky. Then after minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, "How beautiful the world could be." Another time we were at the work in a trench. The dawn was grey around us. Grey was the sky above, grey the snow in the pale light of dawn, grey the rags in which my fellow prisoners were clad, and grey their faces. I was again conversing silently with my wife, or perhaps I was struggling to find a reason for my sufferings, my slow dying. In the last violent protest against the hopelessness of imminent death, I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt it transcend that hopeless, meaningless word, and from somewhere I heard the victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there, in the midst of miserable grey of a dawning morning in Bavaria. Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light shineth in the darkness. For hours I stood hacking at this icy ground. The guard passed by insulting me, and once again I communed with my beloved. More and more I felt that she was present, that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hand and grasp her. The feeling was very strong. She was there. Earlier I mentioned art. Is there such a thing in a concentration camp? It rather depends on what one chooses to call art. A kind of cabaret was improvised from time to time. A hut was cleared temporarily, a few wooden benches were pushed or nailed together, and a program was drawn up. In the evening, those who had fairly good positions in the camp, or the camp post and the workers who did not have to leave camp on distant marches, assembled there. They came to have a few laughs or perhaps to cry a little, anyway to forget. There were songs, poems, jokes, some with underlying satire regarding the camp. All were meant to help us forget, and they did help. The gatherers were so effective that a few ordinary prisoners went to see the cabaret in spite of their fatigue, even though they missed their daily portion of food by going. During the half-hour lunch interval, when soup the contractors paid for and for which they did not spend much was ladled out at our worksite, we were allowed to assemble in an unfinished engine room. On entering, everyone got a ladle full of water soup. While we sipped it greedily, a prisoner climbed onto a tub and sang Italian arias. We enjoyed the song, and it was guaranteed a double helping of soup straight from the bottom that meant with peace. Rewards were given in camp not only for entertainment, but also for applause. I, for example, could have found protection from the camp's most dreaded capo, who for more than one good reason was known as Murderous Capo. This is how it happened. One evening, I had the great honor of being invited again into the room where the spiritualistic seance had taken place. There were gathered the same intimate friends of the chief doctor, and most illegally, the warrant officer from the sanitation squad was again present. The Murderous Capo entered the room by chance, and he was asked to recite one of his poems, which had become famous in the camp. He did not need to be asked twice and quickly produced a kind of diary from which he began to read samples of his art. I bit my lips till they hurt in order to keep from laughing at one of his love poems, and very likely that saved my life. Since I was also generous with my applause, my life might have been saved even had I been detailed to his working party, to which I had previously been assigned for one day, and that was quite enough for me. It was useful anyway to be known to Murderous Capo from a favorable angle, so I applauded as hard as I could. Generally speaking, of course, any pursuit of art in camp was somewhat grotesque. I would say that the real impression made by anything connected with art arose only from the ghost-like contrast between the performance and the background of desolate camp life. I shall never forget how I awoke from the deep sleep of exhaustion on my second night at Auschwitz, roused by music. The senior warden of the hut had some kind of celebration in his room, which was near the entrance of the hut. Tipsy voices brawled some hackneyed tunes. Suddenly there were silent, and into the night violin sang the desperately sad tango, an unusual tune not spoiled by frequent playing. To discover that there was any semblance of an art in the concentration camp must be surprising enough for an outsider, but it may be even more astonished to hear that one could find a sense of humor there as well. Of course, only the faint trace of one, and then only for a few seconds or minutes. Humor was another of the soul's weapon in the fight for self-preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human wake-up, can afford an fullness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. I practically trained a friend of mine who worked next to me on the building site to develop a sense of humor. I suggested to him that we would promise each other to invent at least one amusing story daily about some incident that could happen one day after our liberation. He was a surgeon and had been an assistant on the staff of a large hospital. So I once tried to get him to smile by describing to him how he would be unable to lose the habits of camp life when he returned to his former work. On the building site, the foreman encouraged us to work faster by shouting, "Action, action!" I told my friend, "One day you will be back in the operating room performing a big abdominal operation. Suddenly an orderly will rush in announcing the arrival of the senior surgeon by shouting, 'Action, action!'" Sometimes other men invented amusing dreams about the future, such as forecasting that during a future dinner engagement they might forget themselves when the soup was served and beg the hostess to ladle it from the bottom. The attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is some kind of a trick learned while mastering the art of living. Yet it is possible to practice the art of living even in a concentration camp. Although suffering is omnipresent, to draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly no matter how big the chamber is. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and the conscious mind no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. It also follows that a very little trifling thing can cause the greatest of joys. Take as an example something that happened on our journey from Auschwitz to camp affiliated with Dachau. We had all been afraid that a transport was heading for the Mauthausen camp. We became more and more tense as we approached a certain bridge over the Danube, which the train would have to cross to reach Mauthausen. According to the statement of experienced traveling companions, those who have never seen anything similar cannot possibly imagine the dance of joy performed in the carriage by the prisoners when they saw that transport was not crossing the bridge and was instead heading only for Dachau. And again, what happened at our arrival in that camp after a journey lasting 2 days and 3 nights? There had not been enough room for everybody to crouch on the floor of the carriage at the same time. The majority of us had to stand all the way, while a few took turns at squatting on the scanty straw which was soaked with human urine. When we arrived, the first important news that we heard from all the prisoners was that this comparatively small camp, its population was 2,500, had no oven, no crematorium, no gas. That meant that a person who had become a Muslim could not be taken straight to the gas chamber, but would have to wait until a so-called sick convoy had been arranged to return to Auschwitz. This joyful surprise put us all in a good mood. The wish of the senior warder of our hut in Auschwitz had come true. We had come as quickly as possible to a camp which did not have a chimney, unlike Auschwitz. We laughed and cracked jokes in spite of us, and during all we had to go through in the next few hours. When we knew arrivals were counted, one of us was missing, so we had to wait outside in the rain and cold wind until the missing man was found. He was at last discovered in the hut where he had fallen asleep from exhaustion. Then the roll call was turned into a punishment parade. All through the night and late into the next morning, we had to stand outside frozen and soaked to the skin after the strain of our long journey. And yet, we were all very pleased there was no chimney in this camp and Auschwitz was a long way off. And how we invite those of us who had the opportunity to get into a factory and work in a shelter room. It was everyone's wish to have such a life-saving piece of luck. The scale of relative luck extends even further. Even among those detachments outside the camp, there were some units which were considered worse than others. One could envy a man who did not have worse than others to wade in deep, muddy clay on a steep slope, emptying the tops of a small field railway for 12 hours daily. In the other work parties, the foreman maintained an apparently local tradition of dealing out numerous blows, which made us talk of the relative luck of not being under their command, or perhaps of being under it only temporarily. Once by an unlucky chance, I got into such a group if an air raid alarm had not been interrupted us after 2 hours, making it necessary to regroup the workers afterwards. We're grateful for the smallest of mercies. We're glad when there was time to deluge before going to bed, although in itself this was no pleasure, as it meant standing naked in an unheated but where icicles hung from the ceiling. The meager pleasures of camp life provided a kind of negative happiness, freedom from suffering, as Schopenhauer put it, and even that in the relative way only. Real positive pleasures, even small ones, were very few. I remember drawing up a kind of balance sheet of pleasures one day, finding that in many past weeks I had experienced only 2 pleasurable moments. One occurred when returning from work, I was admitted to cookhouse after a long wait and was assigned to the line filling up to prisoner cook F. He stood behind one of the huge pans and ladled soup into the bowls, which were held out to him by the prisoners who hurriedly filled past. He was the only cook who did not look at the man whose bowls he was filling, the only cook who dealt out the soup equally regardless of the recipient, and who did not make favorites of his personal friends or countrymen, picking out the potatoes for them while the others got watery soup skimmed from the top. But it is not for me to pass judgment on those prisoners who put their own people above everyone else. Who can throw a stone at a man who favors his friends under circumstances when sooner or later it is a question of life or death? No man should judge unless he asks himself in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation he might not have done the same. Long after I had resumed to normal life again, somebody showed me an illustrated weekly with photographs of prisoners lying crowded on their bunks, staring dully at a visitor. Isn't this terrible, the dreadful staring faces, everything about it? Why? I asked, for I genuinely did not understand. For at that moment I saw it all again. At 5 a.m. it was so pitch dark. I was lying on the hard boards in an earthen hut where about 70 of us were taken care of. We were sick and did not have to leave the camp for work. We did not have to go on a parade. We could lie all day in our little corner in the hut and doze and wait for the daily distribution of bread and for the daily helping of soup. But how content we were, happy in spite of everything, while we cowered against each other to avoid any unnecessary loss of warmth and were too lazy and disinterested to move a finger unnecessarily. We heard shrill whistles and shouts from the square where the night shift had just returned and was assembling to roll call. All this came to my mind when I saw the photographs in the magazine. When I explained, my listeners understood why I did not find the photographs so terrible. The people shown on it might not have been so unhappy after all. On my fourth day in the sick quarters, I had just been detailed to night shift when the chief doctor rushed in and asked me to volunteer for medical duties in another camp containing typhus patients. Against urgent advice of my friends, I decided to volunteer. I knew that in a working party I would die in a short time. But if I had to die, there might at least be some sense in my death. I thought that it would doubtless be more to a purpose to try and help my comrades as a doctor than to vegetate or finally lose my life as the unproductive laborer that I was then. For me, this was simple mathematics, not sacrifice, but secretly the warrant officer from the sanitation squad had ordered that the 2 doctors who had volunteered for the typhus camp should be taken care of till they left. We looked so weak that he feared that he might have 2 additional corpses on his hand rather than 2 doctors. I mentioned earlier how everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's closest friends alive lost its value. Everything was sacrificed to this end. A man's character became involved to a point that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he had held and threw them into doubt. The value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and had made him an object to be exterminated. If the man in the concentration camp did not struggle against this in the last effort to save his self-respect, he lost the feeling of being an individual, being with a mind with inner freedom and personal value. He thought of himself then as only a part of an enormous mass of people. His existence descended to the level of animal life. The men were herded, sometimes one place, then to another, sometimes driven together, then apart, like a flock of sheep without a thought or a will of their own. Small but dangerous pack batched flew them from all sides, but burst in methods of torture and sadism. Just like sheep that crowd timidly into the center of herd, each of us tried to get into the middle of our formations. That gave one a better chance of avoiding the blows of the guards, and who were marching on either side and to front and rear of our column. The central position had the added advantage of affording protection against the bitter winds. It was therefore in an attempt to save one's own skin that one literally tried to submerge into the ground. There were times, of course, when it was possible and even necessary to keep away from the crowd. It is well known that an enforced community life in which attention is paid to everything one does at all times may result in an irresistible urge to get away, at least for a short time. The prisoner craved to be alone with himself, and his thoughts he yearned for privacy and for solitude. After many transportations to his so-called rest camp, I had the rare fortune to find solitude for about 5 minutes at a time. Behind the earthen hut where I worked and in which were crowded about 50 delirious patients, there was a quiet spot in a corner of double fence of barbed wire surrounding the camp. The corpses near me crawling with lice did not bother me. Only the steps of passing guards could rouse me from my dreams, or perhaps it would be a call to the sick bay or collect a newly arrived supply of medicine for my hut, consisting of perhaps 5 or 10 tablets of aspirin to last for several days or 50 patients. This shaft incidentally once saved the lives of 3 fellow prisoners. Shortly before liberation, mass transports were organized to go to Dachau, and these 3 prisoners were wisely tried to avoid the trip. They climbed down the shaft and hid from the guards. I calmly sat on the lid, looking innocent and playing a childish game of throwing pebbles at the barbed wires. Spotting me, the guard hesitated for a moment but then passed on. Soon I could tell the 3 men blew. The worst danger was over. It's very difficult for an outsider to grasp how very little value was placed on human life in the camp. The camp inmate was hardened but possibly became more conscious of this complete disregard of human existence when a convoy of sick men was arranged. The emaciated bodies of the sick were thrown on 2-wheeled cars which were drawn by prisoners for many miles, often through snowstorms, to the next camp. If one of the sick men had died before the cart left, he was thrown on anyway. The list had to be correct, and I left, he was thrown away. A man counted only because he had a prison number. One literally became a number, dead or alive. That was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant. What stood behind that number, and that life mattered even less. The fate, the history, the name of the man. In the transport of sick patients that I, in my capacity as a doctor, had to accompany from one camp in Bavaria to another, there was a young prisoner whose brother was not on the list and therefore would have to be left behind. The young man begged so long that the camp warden decided to work an exchange, and the brother took the place of a man who at the moment preferred to stay behind. But the list had to be correct. That was easy. The brother just exchanged numbers with the other prisoner. As I have mentioned before, we had no documents. Everyone was lucky to own his body, which after all was still breathing. All else about us, for example, the rags hanging from our gowns and skeletons, was only of interest if we were assigned to transport of sick patients. The departing Muslims were examined with unabashed curiosity to see whether their coats or shoes were not better than one's own. After all, their fates were sealed, but those who stayed behind in the camp, who were still capable of some work, had to make us of every means to improve their chances of survival. They were not sentimental. The prisoners saw themselves completely dependent on the moods of guards, playthings of fate, and this made them even less human than the circumstances warranted. In Auschwitz, I had laid down a rule for myself which proved to be a good one, and which most of my comrades had later followed. I generally answered all kinds of questions truthfully, but I was silent about anything that was not expressly asked. If I was asked about my age, I gave it. If asked about my profession, I said doctor, but did not elaborate. The first morning in Auschwitz, as an SS officer came to the parade ground, we had to fall in separate groups of prisoners. Over 40 years, under 40 years, and metal workers, mechanics, and so forth. Then we were examined for ruptures, and some prisoners had to form a new group. The group that I was in was driven to another hut, where we lined up again. After being sorted out once more and having answered questions as to my age and profession, I was sent to another small group. Once more, we were driven to another hut and grouped differently. This continued for some time, and I became quite unhappy, finding myself among strangers who spoke unintelligible foreign languages. Then came the last selection, as I found myself back in the group that had been with me in the first hut. They had barely noticed that I had been sent from the hut to the hut in the meantime, but I was aware that in those few minutes fate has passed me in many different forms. When a transport of sick patients for the rest camp was organized, my name was put on the list since a few doctors were needed, but no one was convinced that the destination was really a rest camp. A few weeks previously, the same transport had been prepared, but then to everyone had thought about this, it was destined for the gas ovens. When it was announced that anyone who volunteered for the dreaded night shifts would be taken off the transport list, 82 prisoners volunteered immediately. A quarter of an hour later, the transport was cancelled, but 82 stayed on the list for the night shift. For the majority of them, this meant death within the next fortnight. Now the transport for the rest camp was arranged for a second time. Again, no one knew whether this was a ruse to obtain the last bit of work from the sick, if only for 14 days, or whether it would go to the gas ovens or to a genuine rest camp. The chief doctor, who had taken a liking to me, told me furiously one evening at 9:45, "I have made it known in the orderly room that you can still have your name crossed off the list. You may do so up till 10 o'clock. I told him that this was not my way, that I had learned to let the fate take its course. I might as well stay with my friends, I said. There was a look of pity in his eyes, as if he knew. He shook my hand silently, and as though it were farewell not for life but for life. Slowly I walked back to my hut. There I found a good friend waiting for me. "You really want to go with them?" "Yes, I'm going." Tears came to his eyes, and I tried to comfort him. Then there was something else to do, to make my will. "Listen, Otto, if I don't get back home to my wife, and if you should see her again, then tell her that I talked of her daily, hourly. You remember? Secondly, I have loved her more than anyone. Thirdly, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through here. Otto, where are you now? Are you alive? What has happened to you since our last hour together? Did you find your wife again? And do you remember how I made you learn my will by heart, word for word, in spite of our childlike tears? The next morning I departed with the transport. This time it was not for ruse. We were not heading for the gas chamber, and we actually did go to a rest camp. Those who had pitied me remained in a camp where the famine was to rage even more fiercely than in our new camp. They tried to save themselves, but they remained in camp where famine was to rage. I met a friend from the old camp who related to me how he, as a camp policeman, had searched for a piece of human flesh that was missing from a pile of corpses. He confiscated it from a pot in which he had found it cooking. Cannibalism had broken out. I had left just in time. Does this not bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, but threatened him. He begged his master to give him fastest horse so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met death and questioned him, "Why did you terrify and threaten my servant?" "I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran," said Death. The camp inmate was frightened of making decisions and of taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was a result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master, that one must not try to influence it in any way, but instead let it take its own course. In addition, there was a great apathy which contributed in no small part of decisions had to be made, decisions which spell life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. This escape from commitment was more apparent when the prisoner had to make the decision for or against an escape attempt. In those minutes in which he had to make up his mind, and it was always a question of minutes, he suffered the tortures of hell. Should he make the attempts to flee? Should he take a risk? I too experienced this torment. As the battlefront drew nearer, I had the opportunity to escape. A colleague of mine who had to visit huts outside the camps in the course of his medical duties wanted to escape and take me with him. Under the pretense of holding a consultation about the patient, whose illness required a specialist's advice, he smuggled me out. Outside the camp, a member of a foreign resistance movement was to supply us with uniforms and documents. At the last moment, there were some technical difficulties and we had to return to camp once more. We used this opportunity to provide ourselves with provisions, a few rotten potatoes, and to look for a rucksack. We broke into an empty hut of the women's camp, which was vacant, as the woman had been sent to another camp. The hut was in great disorder. It was obvious that many women had acquired supply and fled. There were rags, straw, rotting food, and broken crockery. Some bowls were still in good condition and would have been very valuable to us, but we decided not to take them. We knew that lately, as conditions had become desperate, they had been used not only for food, but also as wash baskets and chamber pots. However, some people were forced to break this rule, especially the typhus patients who were much too weak to go outside even with help. While I acted as a screen, my friend broke into the hut and I returned shortly with a rucksack, which he hid under his coat. He had seen another one outside, which I was to take. So we changed places and I went in. As I searched in the rubbish, finding the rock sand and even a toothbrush, I suddenly saw among all the things that had been left behind, the body of a woman. I ran back to my hut to collect all my possessions, my food bowl, a pair of torn mittens inherited from a deaf typhus patient, and a few scraps of paper covered with shorthand notes. I made a quick last round of my patients who were lying huddled on the rotten planks of food on either side of the hut. I came to my only countryman who was almost dying and whose life it had been my ambition to save in spite of his condition. I had to keep my intention to escape to myself, but my comrades seemed to guess that something was wrong. In a tired voice, he kept asking me, "You two are getting out?" I denied it, but I found it difficult to avoid his sad look. After my round, I returned to him. Again, a hopeless look greeted me, and somehow I felt it to be an accusation. The unpleasant feeling that had gripped me as soon as I had told my friend I would escape with him became more intense. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands for once. I ran out of the hut and told my friend that I could not go with it. As soon as I had told him with finality that I had made up my mind to stay with my patients, the unhappy feeling left me. I did not know what the following days would bring, but I had gained an inward peace that I had never experienced before. I returned to the hut, sat down on the boards at my countryman's feet and tried to comfort him. Then I chatted with the others, trying to quiet them in their delirium. Our last days in camp arrived. As the battlefront came nearer, mass transports had taken nearly all the prisoners to other camps. The camp authorities, the capos and the cooks had fled. On this day, an order was given that the camp must be evacuated completely by sunset. Even the few remaining prisoners would have to leave. At night, the camp was to be set on fire. In the afternoon, the trucks which were to collect the sick had not yet appeared. Instead, the camp gates were suddenly closed and the barbed wire closely was so that no one could attempt an escape. The remaining prisoners seemed to be destined to burn with the camp. For the second time, my friend and I decided to escape. We had been given an order to bury 3 men outside the barbed wire fence. We were the only two in the camp who had strength enough to do the job. Nearly all the others lay in the few huts which were still in use, prostrate with fever and delirium. We now made our plans. Along with the first body, we would smuggle out my friend's rucksack, hiding it in the old laundry tub which served as a coffin. When we took out the second body, we would also carry out my rucksack, and on the third trip, we intended to make our escape. The first 2 trips went according to plan. After we returned, I waited while my friend tried to find a piece of bread so that we would have something to eat during the next few days in the woods. I waited. Minutes passed. I became more and more impatient as he did not return. After 3 years of imprisonment, I was picturing freedom joylessly. The very moment when my friend came back, camp gate was thrown open. Splendid aluminium-colored car on which were painted larger red crosses slowly rolled on the Paris ground. A delegate from the International Red Cross in Geneva had arrived, and the camp and its inmates were under his protection. The delegate billeted himself in a farmhouse in the vicinity in order to be near the camp at all times in case of emergency. Who worried about escape now? Boxes with medicines were unloaded from the car, cigarettes were distributed, we were photographed, and joy reigned supreme. Now there was no need for us to risk running toward the fighting line. In our excitement, we had forgotten the third body, so we carried it outside and dropped it in the narrow grave and had drug for the 3 corpses. I saw the last day in camp pass in anticipation of freedom, but we had rejoiced too early. The Red Cross delegate had assured us that an agreement had been signed and that the camp must not be evacuated. But that night, the SS arrived with trucks and brought an order to clear the camp. The last remaining prisoners were to be taken to a central camp, from which they would be sent to Switzerland within 48 hours, to be exchanged for some prisoners of war. We scarcely recognized SS. They were so friendly, trying to persuade us to get in the trucks without fear, telling us that we should be grateful for our good luck. Those who were strong enough crowded into the trucks, and the seriously ill and feeble were lifted up with difficulty. My friend and I, we did not hide our rucksacks now. Stood in the last group from which 13 would be chosen for the next to the last truck. The chief doctor counted out the requisite number, but he omitted the 2 of us. The 13 were loaded into the truck, and we had to stay behind. Surprised, very annoyed and disappointed, we blamed the chief doctor, who excused himself by saying that he had been tired of and distracted. He said that he thought we still intended to escape. Impatiently, we sat down, keeping our rucksacks on our backs, and awaited the few remaining prisoners for their last truck. We had to wait a long time. Finally, we lay down on the mattresses of the deserted guard room, exhausted by the excitement of the last few hours. The noise of rifles and cannons woke us. The flashes of traces, bullets, and gunshots entered the hut. The chief doctor dashed in and ordered us to take cover on the floor. One prisoner jumped on my stomach from the bed above me, and with his shoes on, that awakened me all night. Then we grasped that the battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased and the morning dawned. Outside on the pole at the camp gate, a white flag floated in the wind. Many weeks later, we found out that even in those last hours, fate had toyed with us, few remaining prisoners. We found out just how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. I was confronted with photographs which had been taken in a small camp not far from ours. Our friends had thought they were traveling to freedom that night, had been taken in the trucks, so this camp, and they were locked in the huts and burned to death. The partially charred bodies were recognizable on the photograph. I thought again of death in Tehran. Apart from its role as a defensive mechanism, the prisoner's apathy was also the result of other factors. Hunger and lack of sleep contributed to it, and to general irritability, which was another characteristic of the prisoner's mental state. The lack of sleep was due partly to the pestering of vermin, which infested the terribly overcrowded huts because of the general lack of hygiene and sanitation. The fact that we had neither nicotine nor caffeine also contributed to the state of apathy and irritability.